Good morning again. As you can see, I'm back at Cerro Gordo Baptist Church in the youth room. It's good to be back. It was heart-wrenching to leave Scarlett and Savannah. I don't know who cried more, me or Scarlett, but I'm back here. And last week, you know that we stopped the study of Romans and we went to the study of the resurrection from Luke's perspective, or his point. And now, today we're going back to the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. And in order to catch us up to par, I think I'd like to review just a little bit to see where we have been in Romans and then where we're going for today. So in chapters 1 through 4, Paul addressed the sinfulness of all humanity. The Roman church was made up of Jews and Gentiles, as I've said several times. But many lived with the misconception that the Jews somehow were looked upon with favor by God above the Gentiles. And, you know, they had a little bit of an attitude of self-righteous or holier than thou. And we don't want to criticize the Jews too much because sometimes we may have fallen into that same kind of category. We might have thought, well, you know, I grew up in the church. My family brought me to church from the time that I was born. I was in Mission Friends. I was in GAs or RAs. I was in the youth group. I've been in Sunday school. I've been in the choir. I've done this and I've done that. We've had our lives very active in a church body of an organization. And someone else who did not live that way may come in and join the church, and sometimes we might want to think, well, you know, we've got the upper hand because we've studied God all of our lives, and we might want to get that little bit of an attitude too. And sometimes we might even, in the back of our mind, say, well, you know, we welcome you to the church, and then we'll think, oh, well, I'm going to see how long this lasts. And that's not a Christian attitude to have. So we can't condemn the Jews a whole lot because of their attitude toward the Gentiles, because sometimes we might have fallen into that same little category for a second or two. And then in chapters 5 through 7, Paul began to explain exactly the sacrifice that Jesus made in order to provide us a way of salvation. And that was a way of salvation for everyone who would accept the gift. And then he further expounded on the fact that Christians no longer live in lives that are controlled by sin. We're born a sinful nature. And if you look at children, they're not really born to be real good. We have to teach them to share. We have to teach them that everything is not mine, mine, mine. So we're born in a little bit of a selfish attitude, and we have to be taught to be good, you know. So we have a misconception too in our lives sometimes that, you know, if we can just get our lives straightened out and we get all this stuff out of our lives, then God will accept us. Well, that's not the way it goes. God accepts us just as we are, and then he helps us. He gives us the tools and the skills to turn our lives around and to live a life that's more productive for his glory. But even so, there is no switch, like a light switch, that all of a sudden turns off the evil and the temptations in our lives. Even the strongest Christian will face temptations. Paul, in chapter 7, even talked about how he failed sometimes to do the things that he should, and how it grieved him so much when he did things that he should not do. So even Paul fell into this category. So now all of this brings us to the focus of this week's lesson, which is just how are we able to live without sin controlling our lives. So we're going to go back now to this book, session 8, and if you don't have that book, then you can join and follow along in Romans chapter 8. So our focus now is going to be on, well, you know, if God accepts us just like we are, and we come from a sinful nature, and how do we turn our lives around, and how do we live a life that is acceptable to him? Well, when we accept Christ, our old sin-controlled life dies, and we're given a new tool. We're given a tool to help us get through that, and that is the Holy Spirit, to live in our hearts to guide us so that we have the power to resist temptations. Now, as a believer, you felt that Spirit. As soon as you say something wrong, as soon as you think something wrong, as soon as you miss an opportunity of an action that you should have taken, as soon as you have some kind of a word or a deed, that Spirit tugs at you to remind you, hey, that's not what we're supposed to do. That's not the way that we live. So we go now to verse 12. We're going to start there, and it starts with the word therefore, which just means that he's connecting what he's going to say next with what he has already said about his difference, the controversy of the contrast of living a life that's controlled by sin or living a life in the Spirit, that Spirit that he's given us to live in our hearts. So he says, therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live after the flesh. And the word flesh, you think of flesh and you think of your physical body. He's not really talking about the physical body. He's talking about the entire life, our entire life that is being lived in a world full of rebellion against God. He said, for if you live after the flesh, if you live in this life and join in with this rebellion to God, then you shall die. And again, he's not talking about a physical death here, because believers and non-believers face a physical death. He is talking about a spiritual death. If we're living in this world of rebellion and we join in that rebellion of God, and we're not living by the Spirit and not having the Spirit in our heart, not accepting the gift that Christ gave, then we are living a life that is spiritually dead. And he says the Spirit, the one that is here to help us, the Spirit, if we live through the Spirit, do mortify or put to death the deeds of the body, then you shall live. We shall have a spiritual life. So, walking with the Spirit simply means we're living in a manner that is cooperating with the Spirit that God has given to us. That Spirit that's in our heart, we're cooperating with that. And yes, we're going to fall short. We're going to do things. We're going to say things. We're going to think things. And that Spirit's going to remind us immediately. And we're going to cooperate with that. Our cravings for sin diminish somewhat. We long to spend more time with God. We long to be more thankful to God for all of the blessings, and we begin to realize the blessings that God has given to us. You know, a lot of times we think, oh boy, that I was lucky, or that was just in time. Well, you know, a lot of times when we have the Spirit in our heart, we're not saying, oh, we were lucky. We just look and we say, thank you, God, for that. Thank you for that, God. I thank you for that. But this transformation is not just like we can't switch a light, turn a light, switch it off and on. It's not an overnight transformation. It's a little bit like physical therapy. If you've ever broken a leg or an arm or injured your body in some way, for me it was my back, and you go to physical therapy, they don't start with the hard exercises first. They start with the small ones, and you practice that a while, and then they give you another little one, and it's in increments until you get to your full potential strength. Well, that's the same way it is with spiritual therapy. You start adhering to the Spirit. First of all, you start hearing that Spirit. It starts telling you, and you start being aware that it's there and that you're listening to it. And then after a while, we want to read the Bible more. We want to know what God's Word has to say for us. And then our prayer life becomes stronger. And we begin to live more and more as a conscious awareness of God in our lives and how God has blessed us. So many times we take for granted. You walk around now, if you look at the earth now, and it's changing, and you know, all those trees that were just brown sticks sticking out of the ground, now they're full of foliage and beautiful flowers and leaves, and we sort of take that for granted. Well, after we develop our spiritual therapy and we get as far as we can in this world into using our spirit, then we begin to become more consciously aware that God is around us. He abounds and He blesses us every day. But now, following the Spirit is not just about obedience to the Spirit. Of course, we want to be obedient, but it's a lot about our identity. And that brings us to verses 14 and 15. Our identity. Well, now, who are we exactly? Who are we if we have accepted Christ's gift and we're living with the Spirit in our hearts? He said, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. When you say the word son, that means it's a family relationship. You know, there's no greater love than what I have for my son or for my daughter. There's a family relationship. So he says, okay, if we're led by the Spirit of God, we are the sons of God. Now, the Jews thought they were related to God. They saw themselves as God's children by their history because God made a covenant with their father Abraham. And that covenant was passed down through generations. And they felt like they were related to God. Their relationship with God came about because of their history. But Paul had to change that way of thinking. He said, no, our relationship with God comes about as the Spirit that God gives us. God's Spirit creates a family relationship. We're God's son, we're God's daughter, we have that family. And then he says, for ye have not received the spirit of bondage. Now, no, of course not, we haven't received the spirit of bondage, but what did he mean by that? Paul was a really good teacher and preacher. He was really good about speaking to his audience in ways that they could understand. The Jews understood the laws a lot. So when he spoke to a group of Jews, he could talk about the laws. They understood that. When he spoke to a group of Gentiles, he had to make it a little bit more simplified version so that they could understand, because they were not given the law of Moses immediately like the Jewish people were. It's the same with us. If we're speaking to adults, we're going to speak one way and use one kind of example, maybe to drive home our point. But if we're talking to children or youth, then we have to use a different kind of example. But when Paul said, we have not received the spirit of bondage, again, to fear, what he was referring to was something that they could understand. Because the family unit in Paul's day consisted of slaves and children. The family had slaves and children. And he said, we're not adopted as slaves who were in bondage, again, to fear. We're not adopted as slaves. We're adopted. We're the sons of God. We're adopted. We have a family relationship with God, but it's not as a slave. We're adopted as a child on equal status to the other children already established in the family. Now you want to stop there and think, well, now, who was the first child that was established in God's family? And that was Jesus. He said, you're adopted as a child in that family, and it says, you have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. In other words, we can cry, Father, dear Father. Because as adopted children, Christians have a right to refer to God as their Father, our Father in heaven. And that's when we're adopted as a child. We've been adopted in a sense of love and not one of bondage. And the slaves did not. They might have been a part of the family at that time, but they did not have that sense of love that the family members had. So, if we have that spirit, and it gives us that relationship with God, the family relationship with God, then what else does it do for us? Of course, it tugs at our heart, and it reminds us, if we're walking a straight path and we step off, he says, get back on there, get back over here, you got to get back on this path. So here's also what it can do for us. At times, it's not unusual for us to struggle with doubts and wonder if our relationship with God is real. It happens, but that's when we allow the devil to get in our mind, and he'll remind us of things that we've done and sins that we've committed. But God has forgiven us of those sins, and when he forgives us, he says he's going to throw those sins into the sea of forgetfulness. And I like to say, and he puts up a no fishing sign there. So we don't let the devil creep into our mind. We keep the Spirit of God in our heart. And he said, when this happens, when we begin to have questions, sometimes when hardships comes along, or sickness, or a burden, we kind of wonder, well, is God real? Does he even hear me? Is he hearing my prayers? Why is he not answering my prayers? And God's listening. He listens to us. But it says, the Spirit itself at these times beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. So that Spirit has to remind us of our status as God's children. And as his children, we are also heirs. It says, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. So if we're heirs, that means we're going to inherit something. So as an heir, what are we going to inherit? What exactly do we inherit from God? Well, we inherit access to God's riches. Not that God's going to make us all rich, but God's riches are for forgiveness and love and mercy and grace, and our needs are being met, and also it is a hope that God gives us. That's what we inherit. We inherit that peace that passes understanding. But then in the next part of this scripture, it says, we've inherited all of these great things. We have access to God's riches. But it says, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. Well, we know we don't want to talk about suffering. We don't want to think that we've got to suffer. But we know that Jesus suffered on this earth. He was rejected by his very own, the people that were selected, the Jews. The Jewish religious leaders were the ones that led a crowd to cry, crucify him. He was rejected. The Romans knew about suffering for their faith. Now, we've heard and seen on the news some Christians in our modern day who have also suffered most of the time in other countries for their faith. And Paul certainly knew what suffering was about. He was stoned and left for dead at one time. So, in this it says, if we suffer as Christ, then we're also going to be glorified as Christ. And then what Paul says about that is, our lives, we may not be stoned, but sometimes we suffer and have hardships, and sometimes it's because of our faith, because sometimes when we become stronger in our faith, sometimes our friends reject us. They don't like that new person. They want the old person that joined in, and with the camaraderie. So what Paul said about the suffering in verse 18 was, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. He said, yeah, you might suffer. Jesus suffered. Paul suffered. He was stoned, left for dead. Our modern day Christians in some countries have suffered. But Paul said, that suffering does not compare to the glory that will be revealed to us. Now, in the next scriptures, there's a lot of glory that will be revealed, and it speaks of the creation that God made. When God created the world, it was good, but sin marred the creation. So I want to read a few scriptures here from Genesis chapter 3, and it explains a lot, if you think about it, about what we have in our world. And it says in chapter 3, verse number 17 through 19, it says, to Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Think about how God created the earth, and I don't even know if our minds can imagine how beautiful and perfect it was. But because of sin, he now says, cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. Adam and Eve didn't have to do anything for their food, for their needs. It was there. All they had to do was accept it. But because of their sins, we now, through painful toil, eat food from all the days of our lives. And it says, it will produce thorns and thistles for you. Have any of you been out trying to get the weeds and the thornies and the thistles out of your flower gardens or your vegetable garden? God said because of that sin, this earth, this creation that He made that was so perfect, will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. So even God's creation, the beautiful creation, think about the Garden of Eden, if you can imagine how beautiful a place that could have been, and it must have been, even that will be glorified, because even that was changed because of sin. He said, for the earnest expectation of the creature, the creation, waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature, the creation, was made subject to vanity or futility, which was of no use. To be a vain and futile means it's of no use. It was made that way. Nature didn't do it. Not willingly did it happen, but by reason of Him who hath subjected the same in hope. The very ones that God appointed as stewards of His creation are responsible for its state of decay and chaos that the world is in. They're responsible. The sin in our lives, God's creation didn't do that. Nature didn't do that. God's creation fell victim to man's sins. But God said, wait, there's hope for that too. He said, because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption. This creation that's been corrupt with the thorns and the thistles and the hard work and the toil, it's going to be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. So God says even the earth is going to be manifest in glorification. Now, and then Paul used another example, another human image to illustrate his point that he was trying to make, and that was the one of childbirth. He said in verse 22, for we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. Creation has been groaning under the weight of sin. Just like the pain and the groans of childbirth result in a new human. And if you've ever given birth to a child, you know all of those pains are almost, they feel like they're unbearable, but as soon as you get to hold that little baby, you forget it all. It's all in the past because you've got this new little human being. He said earth is being groaning. It's been groaning. It's been in pain because of the sin that's been was placed upon it, and because of the changes that were made and made it imperfect because of that. But he says there's going to be a new heaven and an earth. In Revelations it says there'll be a new heaven and earth. The results of God's glory is going to be on this earth. But then it's also going to be with the people too. So, you know, if God's glory is going to restore this earth to the perfect state that He made it and the beautiful state that He made it, how is it going to affect people? So we go down to verse 29. So, because he's now speaking of believers, we believers are not promised an easy life. We have a life of hardships and sufferings. Our bodies have issues. They have aches and pains. The older we get, the stiffer we get. Our relationships fall apart. A lot of times that's because of pride or because of egos. But Paul says here in verse 23, he said, not only they, referring to the creation in the previous verses, not only that, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves, groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption to wit, the redemption of our body. And he said we have the first fruits. Now, the first fruits are the very first part of any kind of a crop. You think about, in a little while, people are going to have those little small Irish potatoes, the first ones, how good they are. We're going to pick our first butter beans or our first garden peas, or we're going to pick our first squash. the first fruit is an indication of a full harvest that's going to come later. So he said, God, he's given us this little spirit to live in our hearts and to help us along the way as we go through this earth, we live through this earth. But it is just a promise. That serves as just a drop in the bucket of the glory that's going to be seen later when God manifests his glory. It's only a down payment. So you think about, well, if I've got that spirit and it speaks to me and it helps me to feel worthy and loved by God, well, that's just one little part of what's going to come later on. Now, so when our full inheritance is revealed, God will free our bodies from the decay and the corruption. Just like he's going to free the earth, the creation, from the decay and the corruption, he's going to free our bodies from decay and corruption, from aches, from pains, from diseases, from sicknesses. They will be glorified as well. Now, earlier in the chapters, Paul had introduced the concept of hope. And in this verse now, 24-25, he's going to return to that concept of hope. Now, we think about something we hope is going to happen, and it happens where we don't hope for it anymore. That's just, why would we? We've already received it. And he says, for we are saved by hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. We don't need faith and trust if we've already received what we've been hoping for. We don't need the faith and the trust for that. He said, for what a man seeth, what doth he yet hope for? But if we hope for that we see not, we haven't seen the glory of God. We've only got that one little taste, that spirit that he's given to us. That's just our little down payment. He said, if we hope for that we see not, for what's going to happen in the future, for what God's going to do with the earth, the creation, how he's going to transform that, for what God is going to do with our bodies, how he's going to transform that. If we hope for that, what we cannot see, then do we with patience wait for it. With patience wait for it. Now, if we live without God, we live in a state of hopelessness. But once we have Christ in our lives and we accept the gift of salvation, then we have this hope. And it's a hope is what will be revealed and manifested in the future in God's time. But that hope, he says, requires us to have patience. And in our world, a lot of times we don't do so good with waiting. Patience requires us to wait. We don't do so hot with waiting. We have come to live in a world of instant gratification. We get a little impatient and disturbed when we have to wait too long in the drive-through line to pick up our food. If there's someone stopped ahead of us at a red light and they don't move as soon as it turns green, we get a little bit impatient. We might honk a horn. And God said we need to learn to have patience in our lives. The Spirit of God is what gives us the skill set to use this patience in our lives. So as we patiently wait for the fulfillment of our hope, we live as his children. We have to wait. There's a waiting period. But we have to live now. And how we live now is to live as God's children. But our world is still a messy place. There's still a lot of evil. There's still a lot of bad things that go on. So how do we calm the noise of all the corrupt and the rebellion against God that's around us? How do we calm that and not listen to that? We have to focus on the Spirit to lead us. So our take home, I think, from this week's lesson is that as we have all this time to evaluate ourselves, are we patiently allowing the Spirit to guide us, or are we finding ourselves not waiting for God to accomplish his plan? And he does have a plan. We don't know what it is, but he has a plan. And I want to read something. This little devotion, Angie and Ricky and the boys gave to me for Christmas, and it's one for every day of the year. And I know some of you have seen little parts of it online. Somebody else has this book too. But sometimes the devotions of the day are so touching. It's almost like I'm shocked that God, you put this in there for me to read today. How awesome is that? And I don't think it's just a happenstance, because God does have a plan. And today's devotion reads like this: I am training you in steadfastness. Too many things interrupt your awareness of me. I know that you live in a world of sight and sound, but you must not be a slave to those stimuli. Awareness of me can continue in all circumstances, no matter what happens. This is the steadiness I desire for you. This is the patience that God desires for us. And it goes on to say, don't let unexpected events throw you off course. Rather, respond calmly and confidently, remembering that I am with you. As soon as something grabs your attention, talk with me about it. Thus, I share your joys and your problems. I help you cope with whatever is before you. This is how I live in you, that Spirit in you, and work through you. This is the way of peace. And I do pray that something has meant something to you, that you can take a lesson, take some words from this lesson and use it in your daily lives. I hope that we all will continue to pray earnestly every day for our country, for our world, for our leaders, and pray for our church. We need to really appreciate the efforts that our preacher makes to keep us as normal as possible in our circumstances. Many years ago, we wouldn't be able to be together as we are now. We would be totally apart and isolated. So I just pray that all of this makes sense to you, and that we will be together again soon, together in person, in face. And I thank you for listening to the sermon, to the lesson. I just hope that you've gotten a message from it. Thank you.